Okay, I'm going to be sending two videos because somehow my computer just kicked me off again. And this is actually my second and a half time of going through all this. So there'll be a short segment, and now this one. Where I left off was Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement of back in the 60s. He was very diligent as an African American in his protests, and everything about him was peace and being professional. He was always well dressed, and he was always ready to protest. He was a God-fearing reverend, and his protests are still talked about to this day, as well as his actions. So I do not condemn at all protesting. I stated that in my paper. However, it's the actions that lead to out of control behavior that spark from these protests that I would love to try and contrast, and I would love to see the Black Lives Matter community show their disapproval of these events. There's an African American woman named Barbara Reynolds. She was a civil rights activist back in the 60s, she states. And she has this to say about the movements. She says, but at protests today, sorry, there's the documents here. It's difficult to distinguish between legitimate activists and from those that are mob actors who burn and loot. The demonstrators are peppered with hate speech, profanity, and guys with sagging pants that show their underwear. Even if the Black Lives Matter activists aren't the ones participating in the boorish language and dress, neither are they condemning it. Now that's from a lady again named Barbara Reynolds, who's an African American activist and civil rights activist from back in the 60s. She believes that the true members of the Black Lives Matter group need to denounce what they do not support. They need to separate themselves from this behavior and show that they are peaceful protesters trying to make a difference and not just cause more aggression. And I tend to agree with her. You know, eye for an eye behavior is never acceptable, and it will only lead to further revenge-seeking activity. Some other dangerous, lethal events happened. There was a sniper that shot 5 and wounded 7 other. So 12 officers involved altogether. Shot 12 officers at a what started out as a peaceful Black Lives Matter movement in Dallas, Texas, in the summer of 2016. They were protesting the killings that week of an African American gentleman named Alton Sterling from Louisiana, and then there was a Philando Castile who had been shot in Minnesota that week. The sniper actually did not claim at all to be affiliated with the Black Lives Matter movement. He did, however, say that he supported Black Lives Matter, and he knew that at their protests he would have his chance to get revenge on the officers. My argument was, you know, if you support Black Lives Matter and you're advocating that Black lives do matter as much as white, are you saying that they matter more than white people? Because if you go to a protest about 2 black men that were killed and have to shoot and attempt to kill 12 men in the stead of those 2 African American gentlemen that you're advocating for, it seems to me that you would be also advocating that white lives do not matter and are more expendable than black lives, which is the exact thing that you're trying to protest from a vice versa standpoint. So that it just strikes me as very hypocritical when these things like this happen. Granted, like I said, I know that he wasn't exactly a Black Lives Matter member, but he did support them, and he did stand with them on a lot of things. Another thing that was non-favorable for law enforcement after Black Lives Matter came about, the Black Lives Matter movement stemmed a chain of events, and one of those was the American Civil Liberties Union went up against the Chicago PD and gained the right to audit all of their legal stops on the road to audit for discrimination. So, just to be stated prior to talking about that, in Chicago in 2015, African Americans made up 79% of all non-fatal shooting suspects, 85% of all known robbery suspects, and 77% of all known murder suspects. Caucasian Americans made up 1% of known non-fatal shooting suspects, 2.5% of known robbery suspects, and 5% of known murder suspects. Very drastic difference in statistics there. Regardless of that data, the ACLU decided that there was discriminatory evidence there, that too many non-white individuals were being pulled over, and they decided to intervene. They made the auditing, in order to audit, they made the cards that the officers have to fill out when they pull someone over. They made them 3 times the amount of literature. So a pullover that could take 15 to 30 minutes max was now taking 30 minutes to an hour, and sometimes longer than an hour max. So it decreased by 90% the amount of people that they pulled over in the year of 2016. That being said, there were many places where they could have randomly found drugs and illegal firearms and things that did not happen, and also they had a drastic increase in cold cases, because where before, whenever they made random stops and logged a lot more on a gross scale, a lot more of getaway vehicles into the system. I say getaway vehicles because when they're later used for a getaway vehicle, if a plate number or if identification of a vehicle is given, then that is already in the system from a prior event of being pulled over, and they had a lot more to go off of. And now these vehicles, even if they got the license plates on them, it was a lot harder to track and get these people, because that's the first time they'd ever been in the system. That being stated, this led to a drastic decline in the efficiency of the Chicago PD. So, as mentioned prior, civil rights movement have evolved over the years, but the voice stays the same, and the principle stays the same of how they go about it. It's just the violent actions that occur and the way they occur. And there was a gentleman, his name was Joe Reed, and he describes the events whenever he's in the textbook. Actually, he describes the events when he's a congressman, not a congressman, works for a congressman in Congress, and how he's discriminated against and oftentimes asked to leave the Congress floor and told that this is a time for only the legal men supposed to be in there, and he's one of those men employed, and he is very, very frequently just racially profiled and asked to leave places. And this, over time, sparks a lot of disdain for the white race, is what he claims, and that's why that there's such a racial divide even today, so many hundred years after the Civil War. So it is no surprise that African Americans would want to voice their opinions on this matter. It's also no surprise that they would want to voice their opinions about their loved ones being killed, what they believe for no reason, and them having to lose a loved one for no reason. It also is even no surprise that they would congregate under the name of Black Lives Matter. It makes perfect sense, they're trying to advocate that their lives matter just as equally as white Americans. But although it may have begun as something calm, something collective and peaceful demonstrations, there's a lot of negative, violent acts that have come from it. And similar to Miss Reynolds' beliefs and Dr. Martin Luther King's beliefs, We ought to not fight the evil with evil. We shouldn't seek to kill another human being because we were upset and disagree with the unfair murder of our family. Martin Luther King is still one of the prime examples of how a protester should demonstrate today. I'm a firm believer in that, and I think that the way that he operated is the way that we should try to today. I think that the Black Lives Matter group should rename themselves and try to get out of some of this negative light that has been shed upon them. And I think that they should, while doing this, they should denounce all of the negative things that have went on over the past several years that have kind of given them this negative light, and try to get some closure on that and let people see what they're really about and what they're trying to support. I thought of 3 rebuttals that could be asked. Was George Zimmerman, did he have a gun permit, and what reason did he have to go after this young man? There is vast amounts of arguments on whether or not he had the right to go after this young man. Some say that he was running. Some say he wasn't. Some say he had his back turned. Some say there's a lot of things stated, and I did not go into the court cases to figure out the exact things stated in court. But I will say that George Zimmerman had a concealed carry permit, and I do not 100% support the fact that he decided to use lethal force against the young man. But he did have a concealed carry permit, and he was exercising a Second Amendment right, and was not illegal in that. But whether or not there was reason to defend anything with the gun would be the I do not support his actions in that necessarily. I don't have enough evidence to do it either way. Miss Barbara Reynolds stated that the gentleman, her statement actually claimed that the gentleman's, she couldn't tell the difference because they were wearing sagging pants. Well, I understand this as a stereotype and that, styles are different, but I do support what she says in the fact that if Black Lives Matter is trying to advocate against thug behavior, and they're the mobsters that are trying to loot and burn and destruct property, I do believe that it would make sense, like she stated, for them to be a little bit more well dressed, to be distinguished between those and the so-called thugs that are just out there to ravage and do a lot of distasteful destruction of property and all those things. I don't think that every gentleman out there that has, sagging pants and trying to fit into that crowd is bad at all. To each their own, but I do understand where she's coming from in the fact that whenever Dr. Martin Luther King showed up in a suit and tie, they could not hold him anything against him as far as his appearance and what he was trying to portray. And thirdly, one could say that those statistics of whites compared to blacks is because simply that the white Americans were not being discriminated against, and therefore not getting pulled over, and therefore not showing so many crimes as the African Americans. However, there was greater than 70%, I think almost 75% on all of those numbers given, and that's a pretty heavy margin. I think that if the numbers were closer to 20%, you could argue it'd be arguable, but whenever it's a 70% difference, I do believe that the African American population, there's a very good reason to speculate that they had a higher activity of crime than white Americans in that particular time frame and those particular stats. I'm not trying to make a blanket statement at all. of African Americans being more dangerous or more apt to commit crime. I'm just saying from those numbers stated that it does appear that they had evidence to believe that African Americans were more dangerous in that area at that time. This is my demonstration. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for allowing me to voice my opinion on this matter.